Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Private Censorship by J.P. Messina, narrated by Clark Cornell. Preface. During a snowy week in January, roughly 3 years ago, I presented some work in progress at an event sponsored by Wellesley College's Freedom Project. My talk was primarily about the grounds and extent of constitutional protections for free speech. The student audience wasn't much interested in this, but participants did have a lot to say about the topic of this book, Private Censorship, censorship carried out by non-state actors. They wanted to talk about social media deplatformings, online shaming campaigns, employee firings, and the kinds of corporate and social power that made non-state censorship possible. At the time, I hadn't thought much about private censorship, and it showed my replies. Later, back in my office, I decided to think about it more. This book is the result of that thinking. It is also an illustration of the profound ways in which engaging with students drives my philosophical interests. As it turns out, there are some benefits to this. Students are often better able than we are to see the next big thing. Academic research, especially in my field of philosophy, often lags behind the trends. No surprise, then, that since I began work on this book, the news cycle has exploded with headlines detailing events central to its topic. In the past 3 years, we have seen news editors spike stories for politics or profit, allegations of search results disappearing when they cut against received wisdom, instances in which social media platforms remove content, sometimes in politically charged ways, situations in which people lose their jobs for things they said, or the company they kept, and mass social pressure campaigns used to enforce ever narrower interpretations of norms like civility and political correctness. Debates over events like these have become a constant fixture of our public lives. Stanley Fish once complained that others lacked the decency to stop writing about topics once he'd committed to writing about them. I sympathize. Every time I turn away, some new important article or insight relevant to the politics and practice of non-state censorship comes to my attention. Or so it seems, and yet there remains, as far as I know, no philosophical treatment of the concept of private censorship, let alone a normative analysis of its practice. This seemed to me a fact in urgent need of changing, even if I was unlikely to get things exactly right. In a characteristic moment of wisdom, the late philosopher Robert Nozick remarked that there was room for words on subjects other than last words. This has been my mantra while writing this book. Without it, I'd never have finished. And so I said to myself over and over again that it was okay to offer a treatment of these themes that stopped short of finality. It was okay to just get the ball rolling. As it seemed to Nozick necessary to complement his original prefatory statement with an insistence that he did not mean by it to be taking back what he wrote in the pages that followed, so here, too. Much as I expect that others' work on these topics will eventually supplant some of my own work here, nevertheless, after a sustained period of reflection, the arguments I offer in this book are as nearly right as I can manage. I would not waste your time if I didn't think they were worth taking seriously. No, these words, by way of preface, are not my way of capitulating. They are rather an invitation to receive this book in the spirit of a fellow traveler trying to get things right. When I have seemed to you to fail, point it out. The issues are urgent, and if we are to deliver on the promise of a liberal environment conducive to individuality and the pursuit of truth, we need to get to the bottom of them. This is not, at the end of the day, one person's work. 1. Free speech and non-state censors. Complaints about censorship have once again reached a fever pitch across the liberal West. In other historical periods, such concerns may have marked reactions to book bans and burnings. Often they followed prosecutions and subsequent jail time for things spoken or written. During the Red Scare, they formed the hushed response to chilling state-sponsored watch lists and employer-supported blacklists designed to ensure victory against communism. Against this history, complaints about the new censorship seem different. Here are some examples to fix ideas. As they have ascended to prominence, social media providers like Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, and Patreon have made controversial moves to deplatform those whose speech violates their community standards. For example, Twitter and Facebook banned the accounts of former President Donald Trump, following concerns that his speech incited the January 6 Capitol riot and risked inciting further violence. Deplatformings, especially when they appear politically motivated, have raised concerns about social media firms' powers to censor and control the information Americans can access. One journalist has it that Facebook, now Meta, operates the largest system of censorship the world has ever known. People worry about biased reporting in the news, aided by censorial editors eager to protect the integrity of their favored narratives or their bottom lines. New York Times editor Kathleen Kingsbury allegedly killed a Bret Stephens column commenting on an incident involving fellow Times reporter Donald McNeil Jr. Bloomberg Business killed a positive story reporting on Fox Business that was months in the making. Many others may decline to report newsworthy information that cuts against their editorial angle. Prominent persons in leadership roles have had to step down from their posts following pressure on Twitter and other social media platforms. For example, Teen Vogue editor Alexi McCammond resigned weeks into her post after racist tweets from her college days surfaced. Mozilla co-founder Brandon Ike stepped down following mounting pressure after revelations that he'd contributed some years earlier to an anti-gay marriage campaign. Policy analyst Will Wilkinson was fired from the Niskanen Center following conservative outrage in response to a tongue-in-cheek suggestion that the best way for Biden to unify the country was to lynch Mike Pence. Many others have reportedly shut up in fear of meeting with a similar fate. Independent of any social media outcry, company employees face sanctions from their employers for their on- or off-the-job political speech, raising concerns about employer domination. For instance, Google fired James Damore after he issued a controversial memo on matters of gender and technology. NFL owners have been accused of colluding to keep Colin Kaepernick out of a job because he refuses to kneel for the national anthem before NFL games. Since, the NFL has issued a memo to force players to stand and show respect for the flag and the national anthem. With respect to the new censorship, there are no book burnings, no prosecutions, no laws or committees. Indeed, there is no state involvement at all. And yet there are congressional hearings and executive orders and wonkish proposals to address it, and things are moving quickly. My goal in this book is to slow down and ask some basic questions. What is censorship, and why does it strike us as a grave problem? Is censorship the right concept for thinking about the aforementioned phenomena? Or are complaints couched in the language of censorship confused, perhaps conceptually? Supposing that there is no confusion, what rights do the new censors have, and do they act within those rights when they act in the ways described previously? Supposing that they do act within their rights, is their behavior beyond reproach? And if it isn't, what exactly is wrong with it? Answering these questions is crucial for addressing a further question. What should be done about all of this? Do existing executive and legislative proposals represent a wise course of action, or are they hastily drawn and likely to make matters worse? In addressing these questions, I'll begin at the beginning with an account of censorship and the reasons it is morally and politically troubling. With this account on the table, we'll see that thinking of the previous cases in terms of censorship is perfectly above board. Next, I argue that it is sensible to be concerned about these forms of censorship. This is because, among other things, private censorship can threaten our ability to realize an intellectual environment we have reason to value if we value free speech. Despite this, questions about the proper response to private censorship are far from straightforward. For although private parties and states can both act as censors, states and private actors enjoy distinct sets of rights and duties. Beyond this, their censorship affects others in importantly different ways, and those differences matter for determining how citizens, executives, and legislators should respond when they censor. Before we begin, it is worth flagging a methodological point. In the remainder of this chapter, I will be asking you to consider various examples in the service of clarifying concepts or eliciting normative judgments. In discussing these examples, I will be making normative judgments of my own. Things like, such and such is clearly wrong, or so and so is clearly permissible. It is a background supposition of this work that such judgments can be true or false, and that they are no mere matters of opinion. But I will often be unable to argue for the judgment on which I rely. Rather, I invite you to think about the cases yourself and exercise your own judgment. If it departs from mine, think about why that is. If you come up with a compelling explanation, great. That's how valuable philosophical exchanges are born. Now, let's begin. 1.1. What censorship is. Broadly speaking and intuitively, censorship involves stopping someone from expressing or accessing some content, be it a statement, a work of art, a song or video, or an image. But it must also involve more than this. The doctor that removes your tonsils stops you from speaking and stops me from hearing you. Yet it would be odd to refer to the surgery as an instance of censorship, even if there's something you'd really like to say after the operation. Similarly, I may stop you from speaking by persuading you that it's a bad idea to say what you were going to say. Still, because you are ultimately responding to the strength of my reasons rather than a threat, it is unnatural to speak of my censoring you. You've simply changed your mind. Some believe that censorship is inherently a creature of state. The reason that neither tonsillectomy nor rational persuasion counts is the same reason that describing the aforementioned phenomena in terms of censorship is loose talk. Although you have been stopped from expressing your ideas, this has happened without the exercise of state power. Absent state power, talk of censorship only muddies the waters. For others, censorship is all around us. Not only do newspaper editors, social media platforms, teachers, judges, lawyers, and parents engage in censorship, you do too. Here's the thought. Meaningful communication presupposes censorship. If we said everything that it crossed our minds to say, we would fail to get our true point across. So successful communication requires us to censor ourselves. If there were not significant filtering by experts, we would find ourselves drowning in a sea of barely comprehensible information. So, successful communication requires some to censor others. On such an account, we should see the regularity of censorship as a good thing. It is, after all, what enables us to communicate with one another and to piece the world together. The truth about censorship is more nuanced than either of these pictures suggests. Sometimes non-state agents censor us, and sometimes we censor ourselves, but censorship neither pervades our lives nor is it something for which we should be overly grateful. Censorship is often gravely wrong, especially when conducted by states. But it can also be justified in various circumstances, and is easier to justify for non-state agents. What, then, is censorship? As a first pass, we might say that A censors B when A, 1 intentionally prevents B from expressing or accessing an idea or representation in some context, or 2, imposes some cost upon B to discourage her from doing so. Unfortunately, this definition generates hard cases. A professor who docks student participation grades for those who fail to raise their hands before speaking certainly intentionally imposes a cost on certain kinds of speech to discourage that speech. Still, it would be unnatural to speak here of censorship. Similarly, editors of various publications reject more written content than they accept. And yet, it seems to be the exception rather than the rule to categorize exercises of editorial authority as censorship. In most cases, editors do not act censoriously, even though it is often within their power to do so. It is possible, of course, to respond by accepting that our linguistic intuitions are wrong and the definition is right. Certainly Fish would have no qualms about finding censorship in these examples, but allowing any kind of restraint on speech to count as censorship makes it mysterious why anyone would care to talk about it. At least on its face, censorship is a special kind of thing. When we specify that a constraint involves censorship, we mean to be identifying something more specific than the kinds of speech norms and editorial practices that help us get on in the world. For this reason, it would be better to take these cases as an opportunity for revision and to try to come up with a definition that rules them out. We should, in other words, seek a conception of censorship according to which it is distinct from self-restraint in the service of being understood, ordinary exercises of editorial authority, and rules of order that enable our, e.g. educational institutions, to function as designed. To get a sense of what more censorship might require censor, it is helpful to look at paradigm cases of censorship, cases where it is natural to speak of censorship, and ask what they share. Consider, then, a few circumstances in which nobody, at least nobody not already in the grips of a theory, would deny that censorship is occurring. 1. In North Korea, subjects receive nearly all their information from the government under the heading of the Central News Agency. The press is under tight state control, and the Internet is inaccessible for most individuals. Additionally, the state produces propaganda to ensure that subjects' attitudes towards subversive content are sufficiently hostile to prevent uptake. Here, there is a regime of state censorship which aims to ensure that opinions are kept within a narrow range in the service of maintaining power. 2. In the 20th century United States, the Espionage Act prohibited conveying information that officials deemed detrimental to the U.S. military's operations or helpful to the success of its enemies. In a landmark case, Plaintiff Charles Schenck, then General Secretary of the American Socialist Party, distributed a pamphlet to draftees encouraging them to claim their 13th Amendment rights against enslavement and evade the draft. He appealed his conviction. The court rejected the appeal, holding that Schenck's document, circulated as it was in wartime, intended as it was to obstruct the draft, constituted an attempt to incite to illegal activity. Like many other leftists during the same general historical period, Schenck was locked in a cage for what he wrote. Here, a single law functions as a locus of censorship, largely of left-wing political views, although the regime in question purports to protect free speech in other domains. 3. Broadcasting networks have censored speech that is inimical to their corporate interests. Recently, for instance, CBS censored a musical short In the Good Fight, which was ironically critical of Chinese censorship. Viewers of the show witnessed the words, "CBS has censored this content," flashing across their screens. Here, we have a private party protecting its material interests by ensuring that certain of its financial stakeholders will not be put off by the content that it broadcasts. More troublingly, news organizations dependent on advertising revenues from certain companies have suppressed syndicated stories, e.g., home recipes for soaps that would, in theory, allow consumers to do without advertisers' products. 4. In 1933, hundreds of university students in several different cities publicly burned works of literature, history, and philosophy deemed to be anti-German, read subversive to the National Socialist agenda, for the purpose of signaling to others that certain ideas would not be publicly tolerated. While the Third Reich had no doubt initiated an aggressive program of state censorship, the book burnings themselves, undertaken independently by the students, seem to be paradigm acts of censorship even without the background conditions of state censorship. The students wished to send a powerful public signal that certain ideas would not be publicly tolerated. In doing so, they increased the costs for public profession of those views in a way that was experienced as censorious. Notice that censors target expressive content for a reason. Some seek to suppress ideas or works because they deem those works dangerous. This was the case with the instances of censorship under the Espionage Act. Others, e.g. North Korea, sense a threat to perceived political, religious, moral orthodoxy. Still others, e.g. CBS, censor to protect their material interests. Moreover, censors target expression with tools intended to bypass the ordinary channels of rational persuasion. They seek to prevent some audience from engaging with the expressed content. Often they achieve this by means of threats. Schenck was imprisoned for violating a rule intended to stop speakers from undermining the war effort. Dissidents in North Korea can be executed. When censorship is not achieved by sanction or threat of sanction, it is achieved by withholding certain material from the public view, destroying it, or otherwise expressing that the ideas are not to be tolerated. The relevant scene in The Good Fight was removed from view. Book burners try to create a climate of fear around certain ideas. I suggest, then, that we understand censorship as the attempted suppression of expressive content on the grounds that it is dangerous, threatening to moral, political, or religious orthodoxy, or inimical to the material interests of the agent aiming to suppress it. This definition has several advantages over the one with which we began. First, it explains why ordinary rules of order, e.g. the rule to raise one's hand before speaking in class, are not cases of censorship. These kinds of procedural rules are not aimed at suppressing content at all, much less because it is judged dangerous, etc. They are aimed instead at ensuring that the conversation proceeds without chaos. The definition also explains why the biology professor is not engaged in censorship when she requires that questions in class be relevant to the subject matter at hand. She might have no interest whatsoever in suppressing speech surrounding the military-industrial complex and nevertheless put a stop to my diatribe about the same. Finally, this account explains the difference between editorial censorship and ordinary exercises of editorial authority. As an editor of a newspaper or an executive at a broadcasting corporation, I must necessarily make myriad decisions about how to fill a scarce number of pages or hours. These decisions will result in disappointment for writers and other people with things to say. In the ordinary course of doing things, I will need to reject pilots and stories and op-eds. And yet, as the previous case with CBS shows, sometimes I will do so not because I face space constraints, but instead because I deem the content inimical to my financial or political interests. When I block the content in these instances, I do so for reasons other than simply making space for content that I deem better. Accordingly, I act as a censor. One might object that the previous definition fails to capture very well the behavior of real-world professional censors in the places and times that they were employed. For example, the historian Robert Darnton points out that those who were actually employed under the title censor often thought of themselves as men of letters and intellectuals. Real historical censors were often just as eager to approve and certify brilliant works they thought the public would appreciate, and to spare the public from reading poorly written drivel as they were to prevent the publication of works offensive to religion, morality, or state. Authors and censors often worked together. They shared the same assumptions and values. Indeed, most censors were authors themselves, while others were professors and Enlightenment thinkers enthusiastic about ideas, not fearful of them. In short, a good bit of the work of the censor consisted precisely in acting as an editor. The history Darnton tells is illuminating, but I do not think it reveals any deficiency in the previous definition. Instead, it shows clearly that, in addition to censoring, those who held the office and title censor did a whole lot more. They were state-appointed editors and literary critics who felt a responsibility to help their fellow readers determine what was worth their time. Given the proliferation of written material the printing press enabled, they performed valuable functions in this regard. But officials also assigned to them the work of suppressing publications offensive to religion, morality, and state. Such suppression was achieved not merely through state laws prohibiting works with those characteristics, but also by means of threats that those who would publish or print them would be punished. Censors did, in short, censor in the sense defined previously, even if they acted in other capacities too. Censors censored, even though censorship was paradoxically a mere part of their job description. Importantly, our definition makes no reference to states. This means that it can readily accommodate the new worries about censorship with which we began this chapter. Still, the definition is not without an explanation for why we so strongly associate censorship with states. After all, states need to coordinate collective action and maintain power. Such needs confer upon them extraordinarily strong interests in restricting and sanctioning expression, and their centralized power and wide authority to punish confers upon them an impressive capacity to effectively block speech. But private parties too have interests in suppressing speech and powers to do so. In my view, when they exercise these powers in pursuit of these interests, private parties act as censors. They do so in exactly the ways that are fueling today's concerns about censorship. Social media companies prevent, sanction, and remove expressive content from their platforms, often because they judge the content dangerous or harmful, sometimes in pursuit of a kind of community they hope to realize, sometimes for financial reasons. Media organizations seek to suppress ideas that threaten their monetary and political interests. Ordinary citizens mount social pressure campaigns to stamp out deviant speech, and our employers protect their interests by monitoring and sometimes punishing us for the things we say. In each case, I will say that they engage in private censorship, by which I just mean censorship by private, non-state actors. Now that we have a clearer idea about what talk of private censorship means, it will help to ask distinct questions about its normative status. Astute listeners will have noticed that the definition I have offered is descriptive. It is no part of the definition that censors must act wrongly or badly in suppressing speech. There are, at any rate, two questions, and it aids clarity to keep them separate. The first question is whether some party is engaged in censorship. The second question is whether she acts well or justifiably. To see that the questions come apart, consider a variant of the CBS case. Rather than a scene critical of Chinese censorship, executives are considering a scene in which the characters walk through an accurate step-by-step construction of a bomb from easily accessible household goods. The bomb is then detonated at a political rally designed to refer to an upcoming real-world event about which tensions are high. Worried about inspiring viewers to violence in a politically delicate moment, the executives remove the scene when the episode airs. Note that their action continues to satisfy our definition of censorship. Executives suppress the scene because they judge that it is dangerous. Still, provided they are correct about the dangers, suppose there is in fact a 99% probability that if they run the segment, violence will result, they act permissibly and arguably under a duty of due care. Identifying a case of censorship is one thing. Showing that it is wrong requires further steps. In the next section, I offer an account of the importance of free speech. This will allow us to better understand under what conditions censorship is wrongful, which is the first step toward understanding how to wisely respond to concerns about it. 1.2. Why censorship is often wrong. Censorship has long been an attractive tool for powerful governing bodies to achieve their goals. It is easier for states to act with the veneer of legitimacy and to retain power despite horrific behavior when they can quiet dissent. What's more is that states' track record when it comes to determining what speech warrants suppression is remarkably poor. For these reasons, there is now a powerful consensus that state censorship needs to be kept within extremely tight bounds. According to John Stuart Mill, Such a consensus had already solidified as early as 1859. No.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?